Hey everyone, today we're going to be doing a bit more of a free talking video today, talking about the process of tying together everything we've learnt so far into a speed drawing. Grab some snacks, a drink, and maybe even draw along yourself. Before we get going, I just wanted to mention that I will be using 4 additional tools today that weren't mentioned in the previous video. Along with this, I'll be using layers, which will be touched on in a later video. First off, the Bezier Curve tool, which allows you to draw clean, curved and straight lines using whichever brush you have selected. Secondly, the Transform Layer or Selection tool, which allows you to move or resize a selected layer or selection that you've made. The Freehand Selection tool, which allows you to draw around an area which then selects that area for manipulation or to colour/draw cleanly within the lines. And finally, the Opacity tool, which allows you to dictate how visible you want your brushstrokes to be. The lower the number, the more translucent your stroke will be, and the higher the number, the more opaque your stroke will be. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's head straight in. Here you can see that I start by grabbing my palette of colours together and go straight into the sketch, getting down most of the form and shape before heading into the detail. Using the Transform Layer tool, I shift the sketch further left just to match it up with the composition a bit better. I do this as the large left hand of Miles creates a really cool foreshortening effect. Getting straight back into the big shapes and colours again, really making sure to avoid any high or even medium level detail, so I don't waste any time later having to fix poorly shaped objects. I start to fiddle a little bit with the shape and placement of the eyes. To be able to do this, I'm using the Freehand Selection tool, which then allows me to use the Transform Selection tool to resize and move the eyes around the head. I then proceed to use the Transform tool again, just to get the head in the right orientation and shape. Once this is done, just to finish off the head, I use the Bezier Curve tool just to get a nice clean line to shape the eyes, skull and mask a bit better before moving on to getting the rest of the last bits of shapes and colour down. I start to use layers a bit more just to separate out the eyes from the sketch, to make it easier just to get them in the right place. One thing that is key at this stage, despite only wanting to focus on big shapes and low levels of detail, you need to try and make sure that your large shapes are placed roughly where they are meant to be in the end. It's almost like navigating a map. Make sure you have your large landmarks down so that you know where everything else is meant to go. Like the hand wasn't quite right, so I decided to use the Transform tool just to get the angle, shape and size close enough so I can then move on with getting the large shapes and composition down. Remembering again to try not to get bogged down in detail at this stage. This really goes well with the phrase, first get it down, then make it pretty. As I start to feel happy with the basic colours and shapes that I have down, I slap on a background just to separate the character from the white canvas. This then allows me to start working on more details in the work with the different tones. Knowing the colours that will be surrounding the character also helps with knowing how bright or dark I need to make some colours so that the values make more sense across the art piece. The next phase of the sketch, which I touch on a little bit, is the shadows, low tones and high tones, just to get the shape of the object to make sense. For the most part, you can see me working colour by colour in this sketch. This probably stems from my origins as an analog painter, where you would work with a colour at a time to reduce paint and time wasting, as you could only load one paint colour onto a brush at a time, and the longer the paint was out in the air, the quicker it changed in consistency on your brush. Now that the basic values are down, we can start with the deeper details. This is where you can choose where you want to start. It's personal preference, but I tend to start with the biggest or most difficult area in the artwork. I guess my thought process is that my resilience and determination is at its highest at the start, so any struggles can be dealt with a stronger, less tired mind. Even when working in a higher level of detail, the process stays the same. Get the large shapes down and sorted first, then go higher and higher in level of detail, follow that, and before you know it, you've rendered a highly detailed piece of work. One thing that I really enjoyed about this piece is that it comes straight from another medium that I love, which is film, but more specifically animation, and that I'm trying to capture the things that made that movie great, but in just one little snapshot of time. Despite the Into and Across the Spider-Verse films being 3D animation, they use 2D animation techniques to make it feel more human and real to experience, almost like it was straight out of a comic book. So here I am using some techniques that you would see in a comic book with cross-hatching, which tends to be the opposite of most digital work that you see where artists try to hide artist's hand and brushstrokes. this work allowed the brush strokes to be seen. Also, except for the background and a touch of the arm when sketching out the values, little to no blending tools were used in the creation of this piece, in the same way that motion blur was avoided in the film, to allow for the highest level of clarity when viewing any part of the film, and subsequently this artwork too. It's always good to have an idea of the finished design in mind before you start, so that you can keep your subconscious on the creative target that you are aiming for and don't get bogged down in not knowing how something should look or feel. Now that I have finished the hardest part of the piece, I can move on to the next largest part, being the jacket. I use a sketch as a base. I make a new layer and work with the cleaner lines on this layer, as it will be the final layer for the jacket. This is where you can have a lot of fun with detail, corrections and recorrecting until you're happy with what you'll have. Repeating this process of every large shape in the work, almost treating each part of the artwork as its own standalone piece. My thought always tends to go to the phrase of, would you be happy with this being the focal point of the piece? If not, then keep going. This then allows you at the end of the work to confidently say to whomever you are showing the work to, hey, why don't you zoom in on this part, or this part? And it really is a spectacle seeing the level of detail up close after you're done. One thing that I constantly remind myself of is that every design, artwork and object is made up of loads of smaller shapes, and even smaller still within those shapes. Always try to simplify scenes, artwork, characters and objects into smaller shapes when researching references, and even still when you are creating your artwork. Try it in your spare time constantly, and it will make for good practice for when you are ready to get painting, drawing and creating in general. One thing that was really enjoyable was the scratchiness of the artwork and how rough the art style allowed me to be, bringing it back to how you can see the artistry and makeup of the artwork. One thing that really gets me excited with creativity is when you can see the artist had a lot of fun when making the thing that you are looking at or listening to. One of the main reasons for this speed painting episode was to demonstrate that despite being only 3 episodes into the 10-part series, you can get going at any level without massive in-depth knowledge of the software. So if you have an artwork in mind, feel free to just get going with the minimal amount of knowledge you've gained so far, and you can easily make something that shows how fun and creative you can be when you have the confidence to just give something a go. At the end of the day, I've only used 1 brush and 5 other tools: the layer/selection tool, the Bezier curve tool, the freehand selection tool, the opacity tool and the eraser mode on the brush that I was using, which you can see at the top of the screen, or you can activate by pressing the E key on your keyboard. As you can see, the layers start to really stack up, and remember that even though I've not mentioned as of yet just how important layers are in the digital art world, it's best to start thinking about how you can start to use them, especially if you are following along live with this video. Each layer is named and has the key major parts of the artwork sectioned off and separated. Even when using the sketch as a base, I would use the freehand selection tool to select what part I would start to work on next. Crop it out of that sketch layer and then paste it back in on a separate layer. This is when I would start to add my cleaner and more confident lines and shapes to clean it up a bit. I believe at this point the sketch layer has already been entirely separated out into the artwork's key components. If this was for a professional job or for an animation I was working on, then I would have separated this artwork out even more, having every intricacy of each section on separate layers to know that if I wanted to head back and alter anything, colour, shape or start again from scratch, then I wouldn't have to paint or draw around anything, as I can paint over or underneath something without messing with the integrity of another part of the artwork. But because this was meant to be a quick throwaway art piece, I wasn't as meticulous with the layers and did the minimum amount I would need to functionally paint this piece. Hair is a good example of separating out a key part of the artwork so I didn't mess up something that I was already happy with. The webbing on the mask is on a separate layer, as I wasn't sure just how well it would turn out, especially as the webbing here had to work with the curvature of his head. Hair is also an example of using layers, as the belt, shorts and belt loops are all on separate layers. Also in this section, you'll see the part I enjoyed most on this art piece, being the lighting and tonal work being done on the loops, especially as I had to make sure the shadows took into consideration the direction of the lighting and the belt and shorts underneath the loops. The most difficult part of the artwork was the shorts themselves, as I didn't want them to come out looking muddy, as the colour was already that earthy green tone. Despite it being difficult, it was still enjoyable and definitely something that I'm still happy with on the piece. Another difficult part were the drawstrings on the hoodie. Because they were so far from the body and out in the open with that strong background, I needed to make sure that they stood out enough but not too much, as to draw the attention away from the main body of the artwork. So with this, I changed the colour slightly of the red and made it a bit pinker to try and achieve that. One of the funnest parts of the work was definitely painting the web, as without that, is he truly Spider-Man? I thought it would be a lot harder to achieve this look, but I took a deep breath, simplified the shapes and just went with it. Some people say that you can't fail if you don't try, but I always try to flip that on its head and say, well, you definitely can't succeed unless you simply just do. Now that the artwork is done, you'll see me playing around and showing you guys how the layer system works and how you can separate out each part of the artwork and isolate it to work into it without worrying about damaging or messing up any other layer or part of the artwork. Again, I'm going to reiterate that if this was done for a professional job or for animation and not as a throwaway quick drawing, then I would have separated out a lot more of the artwork into even more layers to make it easier to make any changes that my production line manager or client would like to make or suggest. Always bear that in mind when working in a software that allows you to work with layers. Not only is this little bit fun to do at the end of the work, but it's also a good way to proof your artwork and make sure everything looks good and up to the brief you were working to, whether it was for fun or practice for working in the industry. Another fun little bit was that I was able to add my artist signature into the artwork. Something that I've always enjoyed doing is being able to add it into the artwork as opposed to just initials as text on the artwork itself. When you're able to actually add it into the artwork, then it adds a little bit of intrigue and a little bit more depth to the artwork itself. At the end, when you get to see the showcase of the artwork, feel free to let me know if you actually enjoyed having the signature in the artwork as opposed to on the artwork. If this inspired you to create your own work, then brilliant. Feel free to tag us on the old socials. Also, if you did follow along and draw with me, feel free to let us know what part you found the hardest, what part would you have done differently, and what part you enjoyed the most. Well, we'll leave it there for today. I hope you had as much fun seeing the process as I had going through it. I'll be seeing you in the next episode of this 10-part mini-series on the basics of art and animation in Krita.